Well, it is pretty common when you have conversations on religion and why people believe in certain religions to hear an explanation that includes some sort of outcome that that person has experienced, that they became happier, that they became sadder, that they had some sort of outcome due to their religious or non-religious experience that has led them to the conclusion that the thing that they now believe in is true, or the thing they used to believe in was false. You often hear this from Christians, that I once was sad and had a terrible life and was going through difficulties, and then I believed in God and my life got better and happier and more fulfilled, and therefore there's this reason why I believe. I've also heard it from atheists, that when I was a Christian, I decided I would live as a non-Christian for a time, and I found that I was happier. Hey, Travis, good to see you here. And so I've heard atheists say, I'm happier now as a non-Christian than I was a Christian, and so maybe that's a reason why or why not to believe. I've heard the same thing from Mormons, that there's a time in which I walked away from the faith and I didn't live as a Mormon, and I was really sad and depressed and had a hard time during that time. And then I came back to living out the Mormon faith, and now I am happier. And therefore, this is kind of good reason to believe that something is true. And this is something that I often push against. And that's what I want to do here in the show. My name is Ryan Pauly. This is the show Think Well, the show that is here to try to train you to think well about the Christian faith, about cultural issues, so that you can engage well and think about these issues well. And so I'm actually going through a series on a book right now, written by Armin Nabavi. Here it is. This is part 12. If you've been with me in the first 11 parts, this has been, I think, a fun series discussing his book, Why There Is No God, Simple Responses to 20 Common Arguments for the Existence of God. And so in chapter 12, part 12, he is addressing this argument for God that says, my religion/God has helped me so much. How could it not be real? And so what are we supposed to say to this? And look, you may be an atheist watching this, you may be a Christian watching this, and you've heard this in different ways, in different arenas. And so the question is, how do I deal with it? Now, let me just say this. In this chapter, I agree with much of what Armin says, and I think we're going to walk through this somewhat quickly, although I always say that ends up being like 40 minutes. But as always, I want to open myself up to your calls, to your questions, your comments. So if you're watching on YouTube or on Instagram and you have a question or objection you want me to address, put a little Q before it, and I will get to it. If you want to click on that link on YouTube, and call in. Let me see if I can add it here to Instagram. And you want to call into the show and discuss what's on your mind, you can do that as well. So when I've heard this before, right, I spent a lot of time going out to Utah, talking to returned Mormon missionaries at BYU and church leaders. And I've often heard this claim of, hey, well, my religion has helped me so much, therefore that is evidence that Mormonism is true. My quick response is something of the nature of, well, what if a Muslim said the same thing? That I grew up in a Muslim family, and then I walked away. I lived as a non-Muslim for a time, and my life was really bad. And then I came back and started living like a Muslim again, and my life got happier and better. Therefore, Islam is true. The Quran is the word of God, and Allah is God, and Muhammad is his prophet. What would you say in response? And often it's like, well, I don't know, because at that point we're just simply comparing experiences or outcomes. And we all recognize this idea that an outcome you have, generally speaking, good things produce good results and bad things produce bad results, but that's not a consistent rule where it happens every single time. It's not like doing something false always leads to negative and doing something true always leads to positive. There are positive results from things that are bad. I could, simply put, I could eat ice cream every single meal every day and I would be very happy, but that would not lead to a good result in my body. And so the question then becomes, and what I always push back when I hear this sort of reasoning is, if your experience, if your feelings is proof that your view is true, how would you respond to someone who has a similar experience pointing to a contradictory claim or fact being true? Right? How can you adjudicate between those two claims? How can you say that your experience, outcome, or feeling is true and theirs is false? Or do you have to say they're both true? Well, they can't both be true because they contradict. And so what do we do? And that's where we then have to go back and say, okay, just because you had a certain outcome, I don't think it is necessarily a good reason to believe that something is true. And so that's what we have to kind of come back to. And that's kind of where I start, is by saying, okay, how did you come to this conclusion? And what if, or have you considered someone who has the same experience but comes to a contradictory fact? right? So if an atheist, I've never heard this from an atheist, specifically in this way, I've heard other atheists. I went to a debate once where an atheist was a Christian, lived like an atheist for a year. His life was better and happier, not much different. And so you're going, okay, fine, I guess atheism is true, and walked away from the faith. Does that mean that there is no God? No, not necessarily. We have to look at claims and reasons for people's beliefs. That's what we want to look at. So now that's a chapter that Armin is addressing here. And I want to say, like, I agree with a lot of his chapter, and I want to kind of help you think through some of these points, as well as I'm going to push back against some of his stuff as always. And then I'm going to get to your question. So he starts this chapter 12 by talking about how, this, again, the question is, my religion or my God has helped me so much. How could it not be real? And he says, in some places, culture and religion are so tightly intertwined that they become inseparable, and rejecting the tenets of religion can impose feelings of isolation. That's really interesting. And there's some truth to that. And what's interesting is when you look at stories of deconversion, specifically, I studied Christians, people who were part of Christian circles and deconverted out of Christianity. There are some that present a much better life, that they're happier, more free, more fulfilled, that life has gotten better now that they've walked away from Christianity. So again, Christian, if you're going to say because your life, maybe your testimony is life was terrible and becoming a Christian has made your life better. Well, there's a lot of Christians out there with testimonies that say, I was a Christian and I left Christianity and my life has become better. What do we do with that story? Right? And so those are definitely out there. However, there's also stories of people who have deconverted, walked away from Christianity, and felt isolated, felt lonely, had negative results because of it. That's not because Christianity was necessarily true, but I think what Armin is saying here is that so much of our culture and religion and life is intertwined that Christianity and religious groups often provide communities in which people do life together. And so to walk away from one's faith or religion often is an isolating thing, as they are walking away from a community, possibly being disowned by family. There are serious things that are at least a big consequences that people have to think through. However, Armin is also saying here the benefits of a religious community do not prove the existence of that deity. Absolutely right. Just because your community can come alongside and help you and support you and provide for you, and that there's joy and happiness and freedom and relationships in that community, does not mean that that community's claims about reality are true. Because you can find that within atheist communities, you can find that within Christian and Muslim and Mormon and Jehovah's Witness and whatever other group you want to talk about, you can find that within communities. We once had a president of an atheist community come speak to one of our groups, and he talked about all the wonderful things that he does in his community and how that community comes together and supports and encourages each other. And of course, just because he has a community that is encouraging does not make atheism true. In the same way, just because in Christianity your community may encourage you does not necessarily make Christianity true. And so that we have to kind of recognize the deeper thing that's going on here. And I think that's the surface level. Here's how this community makes me feel, therefore it's true or false. Or here's the feeling I get by believing X, therefore it's true or false. Instead, we have to take a deeper look at actually the claims and beliefs of that community, of that group, and actually go back to look at some evidence for it. Now, Armin says here that there is no evidence to suggest that God helps people. Now, we talked about this in depth in like chapter 6. So part 6 of this series is where we kind of look at evidence of, does God actually answer prayers? And so I would kind of disagree there, and I don't want to rehearse everything. I could point you back to part 6 of this series to kind of look at this question. But we really have to we have to be careful to not let people who are objecting to us just make these blanket statements of just say, there's no evidence to suggest that God helps people. Well, hold on. There are like millions of claims around the world of people being helped by God. That does not make it true. That definitely does not make it true. But man, that's something that we should look at with so many claims of people being helped or of answered prayers. These are things that we should at least look into to determine whether there is some sort of credibility or any sort of reason whatsoever to believe these. And while I don't believe every single claim that people give for how they've been helped by God, in fact, I'm very skeptical of a lot of those claims, I provided in part 6 what I think are some evidentially supported claims. And there are books that you can find on this. There are studies that you can find. Craig Keener's written a series on miracles. I think I haven't read this one, but I know Lee Strobel has written a book on a case for miracles. And so there's a lot of work that's been done within communities. There's peer-reviewed journals that I posted for miracles in part 6 that at least takes a deeper look to go, okay, hold on a second. This looks like it has a little bit more credibility, verification, evidence to support this claim than just simply someone saying, God help me, and there's no way to test that. And so we do want to look, and I talked about in part 6 of things that people talk about to be able to show that something is a supernatural intervention, like a miracle. It has to be something observable in the sense if you had some sort of disease that you have medical documentation that that's what you have. Something often it's uncurable. There's not a known cure. It's not like I had a cold and I took NyQuil and my cold got better. It's something more serious than that. And then there also has to be like this proximal intercessory prayer that happens at that time, where it's like, at the time of healing, there is this prayer and then that person gets better. And so then looking at these kind of sequence of events, trying to figure out how do we make sense of this when you have this disease that did not have a known cure, you went to a prayer meeting, someone prayed, and then you instantaneously got better. And there's not this known explanation for it. We can always say, well, we don't know. But there are at least some standards that we would look at that is observable and verifiable that would point to something, and that's different. All I'm saying here is that's just simply different than just saying, God help me. And there's no way to verify it. And so that's what we'd have to look at and kind of process through as these sort of evidences of God helping people. Now, obviously, and we'll get to this here in a moment, but I feel like I kind of keep bringing this up, is that we also there's a different process that I would take to this as well. So, we can talk about people like Benny Hinn. It's like, yes, there's good reason to dismiss individuals like that, but just because Benny Hinn is dismissible does not mean that we can dismiss everything. And so we have, this is always careful. And if you're doubting the things that I'm saying and you're listening to me right here now, I just want to say, hey, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. But hear me out on this. I'm not saying that because the Bible says something, therefore it's true. What I would say is this, though, is that we need to build a case for the reliability of the Bible. And if we can give evidence and reasons that the Bible is reliable, then the things that the Bible says that we have a reason to believe are true. And so when we see in Scripture that God has helped people, that God hears our prayers, that he answers prayers, that he comes alongside and he is gracious to people and he does miracles throughout Scripture. And we're going to get to that in a little bit because I want to address a comment that came in on this sort of question. Then we go, okay, do we have good reason to believe the claims in Scripture? And then we point back to arguments for the reliability of the Bible, not just because the Bible says so, but do we have external and internal evidence to support the Bible's claims? And that would be a different way to build a case to suggest that God does help people, because he says he does in his word. And then we have reasons, external and internal evidence to support the fact that the Bible is the word of God. And therefore we have reason to believe that God does help people. And so I have other videos I can link to as well that go into that evidence in much more depth. And so that would be just a different case. It's not just saying the Bible says so, therefore it is, but we have reasons to believe that God does help people. And so that is something that I would have liked to see is maybe a little bit of an explanation, or at least a nod to that, versus just saying, hey, there's no evidence, end of story. Now, Armin then jumps into part 2. And Travis, I appreciate the comments. I can't get to all of them. And so if there's something more specific you want me to address, throw a Q in front of it or call in when I'm done. I'd be happy to talk through these points with you. But as I'm kind of addressing through the chapter, I'm seeing you just posting a lot of different stuff. And I don't always know exactly what you're referring to after the fact. So when it says like, definitely not, I don't know what I just said that you responded to. So I apologize for that. It may be for other people. I just wanted to make that comment. If you do want to address any of these points, I'd be happy to talk to you if you want to call in. Now, Armin goes on and says, positive experiences do not prove God. And in a sense, right, I would agree with that. Just because you feel happy or better or more satisfied or fulfilled, believing something is not evidence that the Christian God does exist. He says here, I clicked on the wrong thing here really quickly. A person's experience, why did that just go away? There we go. A person's experiences with a particular religious community may be positive, but those experiences are by no means guaranteed to serve as proof of the existence of God. And to that I said, yes, absolutely. I agree. Just because you have a positive experience within a community is not proof. Where are my notes here? That's so weird. Why did they go away? Is not proof that God does exist. And the ones I gave again is a lot of conversations I've had with members of the LDS Church of Mormons, where they have very positive experiences within their community. And that is not evidence that Mormonism is true. That means that their community really does come alongside and support each other in amazing ways. And there could be other reasons as well. The next thing Armin here says is that it's possible to make a positive impact without God. A beneficial community, therefore, does not require a deity nor provide evidence for one. Now, here's where I want to kind of take this a little bit deeper. And I would say, yes, I agree, right? The common objection to like a moral argument for God's existence. So if a Christian is going to make a moral argument for God's existence, it's like objective morality. If there is no God, then there would not be objective moral values and duties. There are objective moral values and duties. Those do exist. Therefore, God exists. Something of that nature. And a common objection will say, well, are you saying that I cannot be good without God? And this was chapter, chapter 4 in Armin's book, where he titled it, Morality Stems from God, and Without God, We Could Not Be Good People. And so in this in part 4 of this series, when I discussed chapter 4, I agreed with the fact that you do not need God to believe in God to be a good person. And so you can have atheist communities who deny a belief in God, or who withhold a belief in God, or who are just simply lack a belief in God. You can have communities who have those sort of views towards God have a benefit or to society. That is very possible. Now, the question I would ask if I was able to address this and ask this, and maybe Travis, you want to engage with this, is the question of what does it mean to have a beneficial community, right? Because the responses I addressed in part 4 was that you do not have to believe in God to be good or to be able to have a benefit. But if there was no God, then there would not be objective benefit. And so the question is, without a transcendent objective standard of right and wrong, then how do we know what is beneficial versus harmful? And we often assume, like a Lawrence Krauss or someone would assume, that human flourishing would be that objective standard. Not Lawrence Krauss. That would be Sam Harris. I think he would say human flourishing is that objective beneficial community, or human flourishing is the objective good, and therefore that's how we know what's beneficial versus harmful. But the question is, why is human flourishing good? And there's a really helpful video between now I'm just blanking on all my names. It's kind of a little friendly debate sitting at a coffee shop between Sean McDowell and Michael Shermer. So Atheist and from Skeptic Magazine, Michael Shermer, Sean McDowell sitting there, and Michael Shermer arguing about this idea of being beneficial. And Sean pressed him on this because they're sitting at a table that had like a chessboard, like kind of drawn on the table. And he asked, well, beneficial how? Like you could say beneficial in the sense of in chess, we have these rules to the game. And so it's beneficial to try to capture the other person's king. And it's beneficial to move your bishop there versus move it over there. And it would hurt you to move your bishop over there because it's not beneficial to the purpose of winning the game. The issue, though, is that we're talking beneficial in merely kind of a pragmatic sense. We're not talking about a morally beneficial. We're just talking about beneficial to get this desired end result. And that end result is a social construction in the sense of we invented the game chess and we could change it. And so we could change, you could go out with your friends tomorrow and play golf and say, hey, the highest score wins, right? And now what was beneficial in normal golf rules is not beneficial, and you can just flip the script. And so we recognize if there is no God, the question becomes, is beneficial then a merely kind of this kind of like a chess game. We have socially constructed the rules to the game, so to speak, the rules to humanity. And we think, human flourishing is this end result we're going for. And now beneficial is defined by that which helps or hurts human flourishing. What we're not, though, talking about, I don't think, and I think this is hard to argue for within a non-Christian or non-theistic way, is to give some objective, transcendent standard for right and wrong that actually is a morally beneficial rather than just kind of this pragmatically beneficial. It helps get this subjective result that we've created versus this moral right and wrong. So as Sean talked about in that video, at least with Michael Shermer, it's like, well, if I, take a piece off the board and I make a wrong move, like I'm not going to jail or anything, you might get mad at me. But there's a difference between kind of this moral claim of a moral right and wrong, morally good and bad, and then just kind of a not pragmatic, that's not the word I'm looking for, this practical good and bad as far as playing the game for the playing results in a game. And so I think that's one thing I would love to kind of discuss more in depth, is that if it's merely socially constructed, then you can say, well, yeah, we can make a positive impact without God in a beneficial, as we define it, way. And you go, of course. But can you actually argue that that is a beneficial thing that everyone should do? That this actually is a moral obligation for all people? Or what if someone comes along and says, no, I don't think that's a beneficial thing, I'm going to go this way? Are they simply just disagreeing with social consensus? Or can we actually say, no, they are wrong? And so someone commented in a question on YouTube on slavery that I'm going to try to get to here in the end if I have time. But that's the question. If it's just socially constructed rules, well, in the 1800s when slavery was legal, then there were different actions that would have been beneficial, that would have made a positive impact because of you're playing by these rules. And now slavery is illegal, and now different things are beneficial versus harmful. Would you say that it is simply changeable like that? It was legal then and now it's not, and we just have changed? Or would you say when it was legal, we were actually wrong because we were going against a greater transcendent standard? And so that's something I would question, is that yes, you can be good without God. You can do good things and not believe in God. But the question is there an objective goodness? Is there an objective beneficial thing apart from God? That is, I think, a deeper question to have there. Let me address, I think that's a good question. Smack dab here. Again, if you have questions specifically for me, I can't get to everything in the live chat because a lot of stuff is coming in. Objective means true, independent of minds. Is your theistic morality true, independent of God's mind? Well, in one sense, yes. So let me kind of break this down how at least I understand it to be. Objective meaning that the truth of it is based on an external reality, not based on what I want, my personal preferences and opinions, right? Subjective would be true based on me. Hockey's better than basketball. That's like someone else would disagree with me. Oh, good. There's a caller here. We'll get to you in a second. And so that's subjective is based on personal preferences, and my preferences is what determines whether it's true. Objective is that the truth is based on some sort of external reality beyond ourselves. So that, in a sense, is how I understand subjective, objective. Now, when it comes to God, objective is morality is not just whatever he says. God cannot just say whatever he wants and that becomes right and wrong. But also, as often referred to as the Euthyphro dilemma, it's not some external standard beyond him. In a sense, though, it is his nature, right? So his nature is the grounding of right and wrong, that he is good, and therefore goodness kind of just flows from him. And so it's not, it's independent from his mind in one sense, and the fact that it's not just his mind of whatever he just thinks becomes right and wrong. In a sense, it's his nature that is what grounds morality. And then his mind then is reflection or flows from that. And so I think it to be a little bit different, than saying everything is purely subjective because God thinks those sort of things. It's grounded in his nature. So I don't know if that helps, but there's a few thoughts on that. And so I will jump back to this section here in the chapter a little bit. A caller did call in, so let me bring you out of the guest room. Paul, thanks for calling in. Can you hear me?
Hear me okay?
I can hear you, and I think everyone else should hear you. So thanks for calling, and what would you like to chat about?
Well, the first bit, the second bit you were actually talking about, when you were talking about morality, and you were explaining that it has to come from somewhere. I'm an atheist. I'll start that off before we go any
Okay.
further, so you understand where I'm coming from. I'm an atheist, and I believe that morality, it is a human construct. It's the fact that we are social animals, and all social animals, not just human beings, all social animals have some sort of a ruling within inside that society, whether it comes to wolves or whatever they are. There's some sort of a social construct there. If you have animals that aren't a social animal, that will literally kill its own kind if it comes across them outside of the say the breeding season, they will just attack uh, other members of the same species because they're not a social animal. We see that in the wild, and like I say, because we're a social animal, we have to build up uh, a way of treating each other so that it's socially beneficial for us to be social. Um, if we go around stealing off our neighbours or killing our neighbours, it isn't going to be long before you're soon thrown out of that society. So that doesn't work for you. Do you see where I'm going with this? And basically, over time, we build that up, and we have different morality does change all the time. You've just mentioned there that about slavery. 200 or 300 years ago, it was perfectly legal to have slaves. So was that morally right? Well, at the time, it was, but we look back at that now and say, no, it wasn't morally right. They shouldn't own people as slaves. But your book gives instructions on where to get slaves from. So you can't say that God's against slavery because your book specifically gives instructions of where you can get your slaves from, how you can keep them, you can pass them down to your children. So the moral standard we have now, looking at your God is immoral because your God was quite happy to have slavery.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I mentioned at the end of the show, I did want to get to the Bible's view of slavery since that came in a different comment. Let me ask really quickly here, if I can, about your initial comments on morality, if that's all right. So I would agree with you, right? In a social contract theory, if you go against society, then you go out. And as you said, that would not work well for you. And so I think that to me is one thought I have is, it seems like that's almost as strong. Like, would you say that we can make a stronger argument against something wrong versus it just wouldn't work well for me? So if I started murdering people, is that like, no, Ryan, you are evil, that is wrong? Or just like, well, you would get thrown out of society and murdering people doesn't work out well for you?
Well, it would start off initially in the way that I said, where wild animals they will chuck other members of the society out if they behave in that way. Where we have now a construct in society where we punish um, people that do things that we deem as wrong, like murder, stealing. They will get punished.
Yeah.
I think it's just if I suppose it starts off really as in a family unit. So if you've got your wife or your mate plus the children that you've got, you care for them. So
Mm-hmm.
then you might have brothers and sisters, and they've got children and wives. So you care for them as well, and the society builds up in that, so that you're all caring for each other. So that if one of them then decides that in the dead of night it's going around and stealing things, then you're going to punish and explain to that other person why it is wrong to do that and why it is bad for society. How would you feel if everybody in society is carrying on the way that you do? Basically, I would teach kids not to be naughty. You do explain to them, how would you like it if you was in that situation and somebody was doing that to you? And you get them to think that way. That's all that's going on.
So what would you say to someone that responds to that and goes, I don't care?
People
Would,
do that, and they say I don't care, and they usually spend time in prison, or like you've only got to look at the people that do behave that way,
yeah.
and life really doesn't pan out too well for them. Society tends to not trust them. You can see
Yeah.
what happens to people who behave that way in society.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So I think so. My first thought on this is I think naturally, inherently, I think most people, but especially me, I'll speak for myself. I want to say something more because I think there's actually more to say. That when it comes to true evil, murder, rape, abusing children for fun, these things that we just look at and say that is pure evil, I think there's something deeper that we understand is true and evil about that event or that fact than simply to say, well, hey, we'll punish you because you're just going against our society's standards, and that won't work out very well from you. That seems like a very
it repulses the rest of us, doesn't it? When we see or hear about these certain things going on, it repulses us when we find out that somebody's gone around murdering somebody just for the sake of it, or raping, or you say abusing children just for the sake of doing it, or the fun of doing it. And also onto animals, if we find out that somebody is deliberately torturing animals just for the sheer fun of it, we do exactly the same thing with them.
Yeah,
so that sort of thing does repulse us, yes.
Yeah, and so I think that would just be one thing, is I don't think we can... Okay, go for it.
I was just going to say, in certain societies, I could see where that probably people would have a different view on it. In the Western world, we have dogs as pets and cats as pets. In certain cultures, they eat dogs or they'll eat cats. To them, I can see their point. If you're going to eat a lamb, then why can't I eat a dog?
Yeah,
it's just that we hold dogs a bit closer because we hold dogs as household pets, whereas they don't. It's the same with if you've got a pet chicken. You know, we eat chicken on a Sunday, but if you've got a pet chicken that you brought up from a little chick, you really probably wouldn't fancy killing it on Sunday and putting it on the dinner plate. Right. You get attached to that.
Yeah. So I think that leads me to my second issue. So there's three issues I kind of initially come to mind when I think about social contract theory that you're presenting here. The first one would be, I don't think that we can give an evil action the type of language that it deserves, of saying this is wrong, this is evil, versus this just wouldn't work out well for you if you did it. The second thing, as you just mentioned, though, is that every culture is different. So how can we in this system, how would you say we can rightly judge cultures who are different? So cultures that practice slavery, or cultures that murder Jews, or cultures that, are oppressive to women, or whatever it may be. How can we look at them and actually say, you are evil, you are wrong, and you should change, versus just, well, we don't like what you're doing, and so we're going to force our views on you? Because that seems like the definition of intolerance and being judgmental, is forcing our opinion of what we think culture should be on other cultures.
I suppose at the end of the day, it is only an opinion. But when it comes to the way that other cultures treat women or other members of the society, I think you can explain to them why it's wrong to do that. Explain to them, you've got a daughter, and you're bringing your daughter up in this society where when she gets to 21, 22 years old, and she gets into a relationship, that her husband is going to be treat her like a second-class citizen. Now, this is your daughter. And you can explain it like that, and you can probably eventually change people's mindset, where they'll probably think, yeah, actually, I don't like the way that this person treats my daughter. And then you can say, and also you, the way you treat your wife. And they might go, well, I treat my wife fairly. I don't treat my wife, which I'm assuming a lot of them probably don't. Or there will be so many that don't treat their wives in that way as class citizens and as an equal in their relationship. And it's just a case of projecting that out further into the society, where they all, hopefully, eventually come to the same way of thinking. Our society itself was exactly the same. You've only got to go to, before the 1950s. Women were, in this country, the UK, classed as second-class citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. So that had to change. And the further you go back, the less rights that they have. There was a woman basically was expected to be a housewife. She was expected to bring up the children. That was a specific job to do, going back 100 years ago. Now we live in a completely different society where women are allowed to vote. They're allowed to take a job, have a career, just the same as the men can do. So our society changed as well.
Yeah. So question here for you. Would you say that our society that has made those changes is better or worse or just different?
I think it's a better society, whereas a woman has the same rights, and why shouldn't she have, as what men have got? If she wants to have a career, why shouldn't she have a career
Okay,
if she doesn't want to be?
perfect. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
And
off.
also, no, you didn't. It's like with the where we came up with birth control. Now, to me, that must have been a big step for women to be able to control when they become pregnant. Prior to that, it was just a case of they're going to become pregnant at some point. Whereas now they can control that and they can choose. They can choose how many children they want. Me and my wife, we only chose to have 2 children, and that was it. We didn't want any more, so we could control that. Whereas going back in time, that's why people had 6, 7, 8 children, even more. Is there was no control over it. Now there is. To me, that's a good thing.
Okay, perfect. So you mentioned that a society now that gives more freedoms and treats women as normal citizens, not second-class citizens or subhuman in some way, is better. What would be kind of your explanation or justification or foundation for giving you the ability to judge that as better versus just different? In what way? Why is it better to you?
Because it's putting less restrictions on members in your society. Even though them restrictions may not be on so much on me, I don't agree that a woman shouldn't be allowed to vote and give her opinion on the type of society she's going to live in by being able to vote and have a say of what the government does. Whereas, let's say, you go back 60, 70 years ago, they couldn't do that. They had no say in it. It was all down to the men to make the decisions.
Yeah.
Now we allow women in Parliament. So, again, 100 years ago, you would never have a female figure in Parliament making decisions on what the way society was going to be run. That they had no say in it. Now they do. They have an equal say.
Okay, so would you say then, though, that would then be a way to judge actually the social contract of each society as being good or bad? To say that a society that has more restriction on women was worse, a society that has less restrictions on society is better. And so we actually have this transcendent standard of how people should be treated or how people should be able to freely live as themselves that we can then use to judge societies as right and wrong or good and bad versus merely each society has their social contract, they do whatever they want, and then we're just simply different.
No,
Does that make
each
sense?
society does have it. Each society does have its different way that it treats its citizens, but I think you can.
I guess my question, sorry, to if I can clarify, is would we just say, hey, they are different, and based on our standards, we think that we're better, just like I would say hockey is better than basketball based on what I like, or can we actually say, you are not only just different, but you are actually worse. And we can have this sort of objective definition, like saying 75 on golf is worse than a 65 in that sort of sense, or to say murdering people is worse than loving people. Is there some sort of moral claim that we can make, or are we just simply judging them from within our own society and say, well, you're different than us and we like our system better and therefore you're worse? Or is there a deeper claim of you are actually wrong and you should change?
No, I think it's down to the society you're brought up in. If I was brought up in a different society, I would agree with probably the society that I'm brought up in. Because I'm brought up in this society, I think that this is the better society to live in because it has less restrictions on the citizens within that society.
Yeah. So I guess I think that's a great clarification that you brought up is I think that the society that we're raised in does, in a sense, determine what we think or what we believe. But that doesn't necessarily make that what we think or what we believe true. And so I may be raised in a society that practices slavery, and that may lead me to believe that slavery is good, but I would be wrong in that society because slavery is actually wrong. It's an evil. And so there's a difference between kind of an epistemology of what we know and how we know versus the deeper question of morality and metaphysics, which is what is actually right and wrong, not just what do I believe based on my society.
Yeah, it depends on what you're basing your society on. You would have to start with a bottom benchmark, and I think you mentioned it earlier on, which would be human well-being. So the well-being, if your goal is to improve the well-being of everybody in your society, then you can start making standards then to improve the well-being of everybody in society. If you're putting restrictions on certain members of your society, like say female, the women in your society, that goes against what your foundation is. So you've got to start off with I suppose you can't start off with, what are we going to say which is right and wrong. You've got to have a bottom benchmark, which I agree would have to be human well-being, and that includes everybody in that society.
Okay.
So it's not favouring one individual over the other. It's got to be across the board.
So
something might make my life much better, but it might
Yeah.
be detriment to 20, 30% of the people that are in the society that I live in. Then no, I wouldn't be able to do that just because it's making my life better, but it's damaging 20% of people in the society. You've got to try and keep it on a level field.
Yeah.
I don't know if I explained that very well.
No, I think you did. I have a couple of other questions for you, and someone else has called in. And so I want to ask a few other things to kind of understand your view and kind of why I have a hard time with the social contract theory. Is my question to what you just said there would be, so that would be your explanation for judging right and wrong based on our society. But if a society was created that had a different standard that said, no, our goal is not flourishing for everyone, our goal is only flourishing for this group of individuals, could we then look at that society and say they are wrong? Or would we just say,
Yes,
yeah, they're different and they would think we're bad, but it's just that's what they think based on their own. Each society has their own opinions.
I think that's exactly what does happen, and we base it on our society that we live in, and we judge other societies based on the one that we live in. So I think we do that anyway, which is why different societies, different countries have different moral codes. For argument's sake, you live in America, I live in the UK. In certain states in the UK, you still have the death sentence. Now, in the UK, we abolished that in 1968, I think it was, where the death sentence was abolished. And to me, that is a good thing. I don't think that a government should have the right to kill its citizens. In the country I live in, my government cannot kill me. It can't do it. Yours can. Your government is allowed to kill you. You have the death sentence. I mean, I'm totally against the death sentence, no matter what you've done.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's helpful. So I think that would be my second.
If I was born in the 1950s in the UK, I maybe would have a different stance on that. I may agree with it.
Yeah.
But I've been brought up I was born in 66, so I don't remember the death sentence. It had gone when I was about 3 or 4 years old. So I was brought up in a society that doesn't have a death sentence. So to me, that's repulsive that your government could do that. So my moral compass on that would probably be different to you or other fellow Americans that may agree with the death sentence.
Yeah. So I think that's good and that's helpful. So that's where so my first kind of big issue with the social contract theory is this idea of, I think the worst that we can say to a person is, well, this won't work out for you if you did it, versus actually what you've done is wrong or evil and you should stop. And then when you look at a bigger picture, as we're talking about here, I think the worst we can say to a different culture is simply, well, you're just different. And that does happen where we judge one culture to another. I would just say that as a Christian, believing in objective morality, and we can, there's a lot of people debate on what that means, is actually to say, not just I think the other culture is wrong or is just different, but I would actually say they are wrong and should stop. And therefore it is not when we step into a society and stop them from murdering, babies or oppressing children or whatever, it's not just us forcing our opinion on people, but actually calling them to live to a higher moral standard that they are going to be judged according to. My last thing I do want to address here really quickly is what I've often believed is if social contract theory is true, then would that not make all social reformers evil? Because the social reformer is standing up against the way that culture is currently practicing something. So if you think about slavery in the United States, slavery was legal. Therefore, you could say it was the good thing at that time. And so then any sort of social reformer standing up against slavery, standing up against segregation, they would be standing up against that which is good, since if good is defined as legal, or if good is defined as what is agreed on, then the social reformers would be standing up against that, by definition, making them evil. Yet we often look at social reformers throughout human history in whatever culture, when they stand up and say, hey, you are violating our rights. We have a right to life. We have a right, like in this higher appeal to morality. We recognize them as good people. And we have holidays in the United States for different social reformers who've stood up against evil and changed it. But I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you can clarify, is if social contract theory is true and good becomes that which society has agreed upon, then wouldn't that make every social reformer throughout human history by definition wrong or evil because they're going against the social contract?
No, because that's how you progress in the society that you live in. Like we already explained, we already spoke about a couple of 100 years ago, it was perfectly legal to have slaves. Only 60, 70 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote. So we change, and we will change in the future. I mean, who knows? In 200 years' time, we may find it horrible looking back 200 years and people were eating animals. In 200 years' time, it might be socially not acceptable to eat animals. We don't know what's going to happen with that. So I think that society is going to change, and it does change, probably by decade, a shorter period of that. Laws change, people may get rights taken away from them, or they'll be given more rights on this. Society is always going to change. So no, having these reformers, no, that's why we're in the society that we live in now, because of these people.
Right. So I think that's a little bit different. Is it's true that societies have changed. We've seen that, and we can argue that they will change. I guess the question is, and this goes back to the previous point, is the best that I can do is just persuade someone of my opinion. So I can be persuasive and I can get you to change your mind, as I can persuade you that hockey is the best sport and I can get you to agree. And so it seems like that's the best we can do. And so, but the question is, yes, the social reformers did persuade or changed society, but in the moment they first stood up, would it not be true that the thing that they were arguing for was actually wrong because it's going against the current social contract?
No, you should always be able to challenge the society that you live in. I believe that we all should be able to do that. And so, thankfully, we live in a society where we do have the ability to do that. We can approach our government and members of parliament, and we can put forward what we think should be changed. We do that all the time.
Yes. So I would agree with you that we do it all the time, and we should be able to challenge society. I guess I'm asking a deeper question of if right and wrong are determined by the social contract. So that which is socially agreed upon becomes the right thing, and going and doing the opposite of what is agreed upon is the wrong. Then at that moment of their challenge, what they are challenging is the right thing, which wouldn't that make them wrong? It's not saying they shouldn't have that ability. It's just saying to challenge that which is socially agreed upon would put them in the wrong by definition if the agreed upon is the right. Does that, I don't know if I'm making sense.
I do understand what you're saying, but again, I'd have to go to the point where I believe that if you live in a society, you have the right to challenge things in that society that you want to change, that you disagree with, or certain things that you want changing, which you agree that it should be changed that way. Again, that's how society works. I don't see a problem in that. The fact that you've only got to go back, I don't know, 50 years, it was illegal in this country to be gay. So that was changed. So that contract was changed due to listening to their arguments to it, and society had to change, and they wouldn't be prosecuted for being openly gay anymore. I think that changed that'd have been 1970s when that was changed, something along them lines. Prior to that, it was illegal in the UK to be actually gay, openly and outwardly gay. It was illegal.
Yeah. So I guess, no, I appreciate those thoughts and those comments. I guess what I'm just trying to understand is, in my mind at least, is a deeper understanding of how do we understand right and wrong within a social contract theory. And I have a different conversation with a different atheist on the show a while back, where I thought, I feel like what we understand to be kind of an oppressive intolerance is when we take our opinions, our views, our personal beliefs, and then force others to live in that way, right? If I, as a Christian, said, hey, Christianity is popular in the United States, we're going to make this the law of the land, and I'm going to force everyone to live as a Christian and expect you to follow Christian morality, I think the country would push back and say, you're horrible, you're oppressive, you're intolerant, you are all sorts of other things. And I think rightly so, is because I'm forcing my opinion on other people and not allowing them to live out the way that they want to live. Yet when we do that in a country to country basis, when we walk into Germany and say, I'm sorry, you can't kill Jews, we're going to stop you. Or when we walk into other countries and saying, you can't treat women this way, we're going to stop you. If all we're doing is the same thing, is forcing our opinion on another culture, that seems like the most intolerant thing that we can do, versus saying what you're doing is wrong and are actually going to stop you, because there is a transcendent morality that we should all be expecting others to follow, and we are going to enforce.
Yeah, we can see in the scenario that you've just presented there, we can see the actual harm that he's been doing to people, like I said, killing the Jews, invading other countries, and what have you. We can see the actual harm that's been done. Whereas you are treating members of your society not equally, as in, say, not allowing women to drive, not allowing women to have the vote, not allowing women to hold jobs. Really, there's not. We can only speak about that. We're not going to invade a country for that type of actions. If it goes to the point where you're invading other countries or killing the Jews like the Germans did, that's where we intervene. On the other scale of it, we try and speak, we try and debate and explain why we feel that what they're doing is wrong. But you came up with an interesting statement there when you said about Christian morality. I don't believe there's such a thing as Christian morality, because for something to be a Christian morality, it would have to be specifically, predominantly only applied to Christians. If it's something that a majority of humans do anyway, then that is a human feature rather than a specific religion. So what would you say is, give me one Christian morality that improves people's lives. I know obviously you're going to say that, I don't know, you can go for the first commandment, I am the one only God. Well, that's not a moral code. That's just God saying he's the one God. I'm talking about a moral Christian value.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a good distinction, is that, so I personally believe in natural law. So I think that we have laws kind of built into morality that can be discovered through using human reason and argumentation. And so things like do not murder, that being, murder being wrong, is something that is pretty obvious to see, that you don't need a Bible to tell you that that's wrong. And so that is accessible to everyone, and we can see that and kind of understand that. I think that a Christian morality, as I would just say, is a morality that is consistent with the Bible and how it teaches us to live. And that doesn't mean no one else can follow aspects of that, but it's a morality that's consistent with the Scripture's understanding of how to live.
Would you agree that society in a whole has actually moved away from what the morality of the Bible would be? I mean, if you follow the morality that's written in the Bible, you'd probably find yourself in prison by Christmas. If you would, I think you would. I think if you was to follow that, because the Bible has no problems with slavery. It has no problem in beating your slave, as long as if the slave doesn't die within a few days. Now, you've abandoned that as morality. You've abandoned, hopefully you've abandoned, and you wouldn't be in favour of stoning an unruly child, taking them to the edge of the village and stoning an unruly child. We've moved away from that. So I don't think you can use the Bible as the good book when it comes to morality, because I suppose you've spoken to plenty of atheists that we can just go to different passages in the Bible that just proves that the God of the Bible isn't immoral.
Right. So I think often just kind of making blanket statements like that, I think there's kind of two things that have to be taken into consideration. Number one is a passage descriptive or prescriptive? And so the question is it simply describing what took place versus is it prescribing this is something that you also should do? So for example, when the Bible says that David slept with Bathsheba and then killed her husband, there's never anywhere that says, now you go and do likewise. It was simply describing, here's what David did. And so that's the first thing that we have to understand is the action here describing what a person or people group did at that time, or is this actually prescribing saying you should do this? Now, with some of the laws, there are still some tricky ones that seem prescriptive or that are prescriptive. And so the second question I think that we have to take into consideration is what is often referred to kind of more broadly as like a covenantal theology. That we recognize that as a Christian, that God made different covenants with different people at different times throughout Scripture. And so there is the Abrahamic covenant, there is the Adamic covenant with Adam, there is the Mosaic covenant with Moses, there is a Davidic covenant with David, and there's a new covenant with Jesus Christ. And so in a very basic sense, these different covenants that God made with people throughout times are like different laws that people were obligated to follow. And so if I have a law in California in the 1920s that say women can't vote, and then I have a law in 2024 that say women can vote, we recognize that it is the current law that we are under that we are expected to follow, not the previous one. And so for someone to say, man, but you live in California, if you follow California law, then you shouldn't let women vote because here's a law from 1920 that says women can't vote, you would say, but that's not a law that we follow anymore. That law has been fulfilled. That law has been is outdated, so to speak, and we are under a new law. And so when we read in Scripture in the New Testament, Jesus came and said, I have fulfilled the law. And so Jesus is a fulfillment of the law. We are under what's called a new covenant within covenantal theology that has different expectations or standards. And so as a Christian, I am not obligated or to follow the Mosaic covenant, which is what a lot of those laws that you just reflected are, is the Mosaic covenant. That is a covenant between God and Moses for the people of Israel. I'm not Moses, I'm not an Israelite, and I'm not during that time. And so the laws that are prescribed in the Mosaic covenant do not apply today, just like the laws prescribed in California do not apply to you in the United Kingdom. And so, that would at least be an explanation. Now, again, people can ask, well, how do you know that? And let's come to that conclusion. That's a good question. But at least that would be an explanation why simply just pointing to a prescriptive verse in the Old Testament that says, here's how to treat a slave, and say, well, Ryan, now you should go treat people like that. I would say, well, no, that's part of a different covenant, just like a law in 1920 saying, here's what you can do. If you go to 1800s law in America, it says you can own a slave. Well, that doesn't mean I can own one now. That law has been done away with.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting how you explained that, actually, because you've just described how society moves forward in its morality. So you're doing exactly the same as what I do as a non-believer and society as non-believers. We're both exactly the same.
I think that there's one big difference.
Go on, then.
I think the one big difference is that even in the Old Testament laws that are part of different covenants, there are still transcendent laws or transcendent truths that guide how we do certain things. And so we recognize murder as being wrong, and that is a transcendent truth to where no society could come along and say murder is good and that becomes a good thing, because that is an objective thing that is unchangeable. And I think even within the Old Testament, the reason why you even mentioned, now I was going to say this at the end, it doesn't look like we're going to have time for it because this is a really fun conversation. And Paul, I really do appreciate you calling in and chatting with me. This has been good. But it's the idea of, you mentioned, okay, it tells you maybe how to beat a slave, but it doesn't, but as long as you don't do certain things. And that's one thing that people have often pointed out is I wish it just said, don't own a slave, end of story. Now in Exodus chapter 21, it does say anyone who kidnaps a person or is anyone who is found in possession of a kidnapped person should be put to death. So Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, gives the death penalty for anyone who kidnaps an individual and sells him, or anyone found in possession of that kidnapped and sold individual. And so that seems to be, at least in that sense, the death penalty for it. But one second, if I can just step back, what it does though do is within this very broken system of slavery of the Old Testament, I wish maybe it was clearer of just never do this. But what we do see is commands given that we don't see in 1800s American slavery. Like if you strike your slave and he loses a tooth, you have to set him free. that if you strike your slave and he has some sort of permanent damage, or if a man strikes a male slave in his eye and destroys the eye, you have to let him go free. There was still a recognition and for this difficult practice that we have to make sense of, and we can talk about that, and I was planning on talking about that, but that still recognizes that this is a human being that at least deserves some sort of rights and dignity that transcends throughout that law. And so there are these principles, I would say, that are transcendent, that we do see coming through. You also mentioned the principle of loving God and loving neighbor. Like these sort of principles flow through these different covenants. And so each covenant is not merely its own subjective thing and anything about it can change. I think we do see some changes to some specific details, but all following with general principles that remain consistent throughout the covenants.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but the same as you. It'd have been better if he'd have turned around and said, "Don't own people as slaves." But what I was going to say was, when you were saying about the law about kidnapping. Now, again, you could probably argue, is that just talking within that society, and people from outside of the society, would that be fine to kidnap them? I don't know, but I'm assuming that it's within that specific society. So another group over there, yes, you can take them from there.
Well, so what would you say is, and when you look at Old Testament slavery, do you know kind of the main reason, and maybe not just Old Testament, but just slavery in that region of the world at that time? What was the kind of the main reason for slavery? I think someone even put it here in the live chat.
Probably from war. Would it be from war?
Yeah, warfare. And I guess kind of all of Mesopotamia is warfare. And so here's where, again, this can sound like a scapegoat and say, okay, therefore it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I think that we at least should stop for a second. This is what I try to do, and say, okay, let's say you do have a war, and you and another people war, just like we have wars today, and you don't have prisons to be able to lock up your prisoners of war. What should you then do with these people of a conquered nation that you have gone into? You either murder them all and just kill them all, or you allow them to stay there, but then you're allowing them now to possibly revolt and to rise up against you. And so without the ability just to throw them in jails, in prison camps or whatever, or murder them, it's like, hey, what if we divide them up and we place them within each family, and each family can inherit a few of these people, and you can kind of keep a close eye on them. But even with that, they still have some rights. You can't just beat them and kill them. If you can't just kill them, you can't destroy their eyes, you can't knock out their teeth, there's certain rights that they still have, even though they're kind of a prisoner of war in that sense. And so I guess my question would be, if we're not saying, hey, obviously we could just say war in general is bad. Okay, but at this time they have war, what would be a better option to do with the people that you have just conquered?
Yeah, I can see your point, and yes, you make a good argument for, we either kill them all or do what you've just described. I suppose it depends. If you're the person who's being captured, and it depends on what type of person is going to be your slave master, whether death might be the better option. It depends on the way you're treated, doesn't it?
But yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But if that slave master had a certain rules over him of how he could and could not treat me, and that I had to be treated with at least some level, maybe I'm not a full member of the family, but at least I had protections, that at least in my mind seems like that's a better option amid a bad circumstance, albeit it's a better option than me just getting killed. And I guess if it was so bad, then the slave could have committed suicide and killed themselves if it really was that bad. And so it's like, I think it seems better than nothing.
Well, no, it just sprung to mind, actually. The get-out clause would probably be to wind up your master that much that he does knock out your tooth, and then you go free, don't you? So I would probably be a bad slave, because I would just keep winding the slave master up until eventually he does give me a kicking and I will lose a tooth, and then I'm free.
Yeah, and so, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how exactly that gets played out. I guess my initial thoughts are when quickly, and so maybe I address this now since it's part of the conversation, but when people quickly go to Exodus 21 and it tells you how to hit your slave, not don't hit them, or when people go to Leviticus chapter 25 and it says, here's how you get male slaves from the nations around you. I would say, look, I would prefer if it just said, don't do this, end of story. But we recognize in the way in which cultures functioned back then, 4,000 years ago, or however long it was, that a lot of stuff was conquered through land conquer and people kind of taking over land. And you could say, well, never take over any land. It's like, well, then, there's certain questions that we can ask, but it's like, okay, if there is a war, if someone comes in to take over your land, let's say you're not the conquering one. Let's say someone comes in into your land and tries to conquer you and you beat them. What do you do with the remaining survivors? Do you just murder them all? Or do you send them back and say, please don't conquer us again, waiting for them to just regroup their forces and come back and conquer you again? Or do you build prisons and just throw them in prison camps? Or do you divide them up among the families and say, okay, now these are your slaves, keep a close eye on them. But even though they're a slave, you still can't just treat them however you want. And I say, look, it's not a best situation. Like, I'm not pro-war. But the question is, in this moment, what really is the best option? And I just feel like often when this objection is raised against Christianity and say, see, your Bible supports slavery and approves of slavery, I would say, no, this is not saying, Ryan, go own a slave. Start kidnapping people and then making them your slaves, because in Exodus 21:16, that gives me the death penalty if I kidnap someone and make them a slave. Instead, we're dealing with a very different set of events where slaves had protections that they didn't have in the 1800s in America, but also in ways in which we're not necessarily dealing with today. I'm not worried about someone coming in and taking over my property. And if someone does come into my house and try to steal my stuff, I can just call the cops. And the cops will fight them, arrest them, and throw them in jail. Well, I didn't have that option back then. What do we do as a society when a nation is coming in to try to conquer us? Do we just stop them and say, please don't do it again? Or is there something else that we can do? And I would say, look, maybe this is not a great idea, but it seems at least a possible solution that is often not considered when the just basic claim is to say, Ryan, if you followed the morality of the Bible, then you would be thrown in jail because you would just go out and buy a slave. And I would say, no, I wouldn't. It seems like we're talking about something very different here that's not being considered.
Yeah, I think you made some really good points there, Ryan, to be fair.
Thank you.
Like I say, we're judging it from the society that we live in now, and we're trying to judge a society the way that it was treating people, like you say, possibly 4,000 years ago. And probably a bit unfair to try and judge them on the standards that we have at the moment and the society that we live in at the moment. So, yes, I do agree. You do make some good points on that.
Appreciate that. Well, hey, I really appreciate this conversation. It's been really fun, and you've challenged me to think about things in ways as well.
My last bit I was going to say was, but just as society has changed in what it classes as being moral, do you not agree that also with what's written in the Bible, you already said then about the Abrahamic laws and the Mosaic laws, so even they have changed throughout the times in the Bible. So the Bible is no different to how any functioning society progresses as time goes on, and how laws changes, and how what is moral now probably wasn't moral in the past. I don't think there's much difference in it, to be honest. It works exactly the same way.
Yeah, so what I would just say is this, and I do have to run because I have to finish the show in 7 minutes, and I wanted to get through the rest of this chapter. But what I would say is the difference is this, is that not all things can change. I think there's an objective morality that if a society changed and made abusing children for fun good, if everyone in society agreed and said, hey, we're going to now make child abuse a good thing, and that's what we're going to practice is child abuse, I would say, no, actually that society is wrong. Rather than just they can change and do whatever they want. And so I don't think that all things can change. And I also would say that things in the past that society thought was good was not, right? And so I would put morality in a very similar category. And this is a conversation, maybe if you want to call in next week or something, we can talk about it, or anyone else who's listening. I would put morality in a similar category as like a scientific truth claim, in a sense of saying that if entire society believed the earth was flat, that does not make it flat. When all of the world believed that the earth was the center of the solar system and the sun went around the earth, the entire world was wrong. And so I would not say that we just progressed or changed. There was a change. We went from a geocentrism to heliocentrism, the earth being the center, to the sun. But the earth did not switch locations with the sun. We instead recognized that what we previously thought was wrong, and now we have what is true. And so I would say that, yes, there has been a change, but it wasn't just I used to like hockey and now I like basketball. And just, it's a kind of a surface level change. I would say it's actually yes, we changed, but we went from being wrong to being right. And I think that's what a big difference is when there's this transcendent moral standard that we can actually judge, or this external truth by which we can judge these things, then it's not simply just progressing or changing, but it's going from an actual wrong to a right, or possibly that we've gone from right to wrong and we need to go back to right again. And so that's where I would think is a difference in how I would view it than a simply a social contract theory, which says they had their contract, we have our contract, it's different now. I would say, no, there's a deeper thing that we can actually judge that difference with wrongness and rightness, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, but again, it still goes back to the point that societies change. You don't have this society morality, and that's it. It doesn't change. It's always going to progress, exactly the same as it does throughout the Bible. I don't see any difference in the two. But anyway, I won't keep you any longer. It's been absolutely brilliant. Thanks very much for letting me on.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I only found your channel literally about a couple of weeks ago. I don't know how I came across it. I just did, and I thought, this guy, you could listen to him all day long. You've got one of them voices where you have one of them voices. You would be a really good storyteller. If you're one of these, in a school reading a book, whatever, I think you'd captivate the whole audience. You've got one of them voices.
Paul, I appreciate that. Thank you for calling in. I'm glad that you found it. And I really appreciate this conversation because we went to other places that people want to talk about. And so I really enjoyed it. Thanks for calling in, and we can chat again another time if you want to.
I'm sure we will. I'm subscribed to your channel now, so if
I
see you going live and I'm not at work, I'll certainly jump in. And if it's something that's interesting and I think I can contribute, I will do. But anyway, I'll let you get to the end of your chapter that you wanted to do. I'll jump out.
Thanks, Paul. Appreciate it. Have a good one. All right, guys, that was fun. Hopefully you enjoyed that as well. And sorry, I'm not going to be able to take other callers because I do have to end in 4 minutes and there's a little bit left in this chapter. So again, we're walking through Armin Nabavi's chapter on how we address religious experiences and do those religious experiences prove God. He says, if the positive things that can happen in church are evidence of God's benevolence, then wouldn't the negative outcomes be evidence of God's cruelty? Now, this is, I think, a really good question that we should consider, right? If you're just going to instantly say this positive thing in my life, yeah, that was God. And then we just dismiss all negative things as there's no way that could be God. I think this is a thing to consider. We often do this, and Christians do this, where we go like Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you, plans to give you hope and a future. And we go, yay, all good things are from God. And then we ignore Jeremiah 44:11 that says, here are my plans for you, like destruction will come upon you. And we go, oh, those verses don't apply to me. It's only the good promises that apply to me. And I think we have to be careful about this, that we don't just simply have this selective bias where all the good things, that was God, and we ignore all the negative. However, I don't think that just because one thing applies doesn't mean something else. I think there are good things that maybe is not a direct intervention of God, but maybe part of the world that we live in, that he has created. But I think as a Christian, we can recognize this. Can God step in, from a Christian view, can God step in and do positive things in helping people? Yes, from a Christian view, he can. Does that mean every other negative thing is also the result of God stepping in? Well, no, because Christians believe in the fall, that we have corrupted human natures. And so we can do good things and we can do bad things. And then God every now and then steps in and does some good. And so I think there's a difference here that we have to think about is, do we actually have evidence this is some sort of supernatural intervention or miracle? Versus, I would say this, God does allow all things to take place, but that does not mean that God is causing all things to take place. God allows there to be good and he allows there to be evil, but he is not the result of those evil things and good things necessarily. Now, as a good, benevolent God, does he do good things? I think he does. And does he allow evil? Yes. I just don't think that he causes evil. And so I think that there could be that difference there. The last thing Armin addresses here, and I got 1 minute, is that if God really is responsible for all things that happen in a person's life, he must also be responsible for the bad things that he at least allows them to happen. That's the next section of there that he addresses. And he says this, if you accept that God is responsible for the good things that happen in a person's life without evidence, how can you not also accept that God is responsible for people murdering their families, participating in religious wars, or discriminating and harming others based on religious beliefs and viewpoints? And again, that's where I would say, well, yeah, we need to look at evidence. We can't just jump to a conclusion instantly and say, without any reason to believe that was God, but that wasn't. We actually have to take a deeper look and recognize that those things happen. But also we have to recognize this, and this is kind of a call to atheists that I've sometimes heard, is that when a bad thing happens, we go, God, where were you? And Christians sometimes do that too. But when, but we recognize, well, maybe we wondered where God was. Why didn't he stop it? But often the negative, bad things that take place are the result of human actions, where humans make terrible choices and do terrible things. And then we kind of put the blame on God. And I sometimes think maybe we have to understand that our own responsibility for our own actions. Now, here's where the last thing he says is this can create an environment of crippling insecurity and learned helplessness. Actually, I kind of skipped the section. Maybe this. I do have to end. There's this last point that he makes here, and I guess I will have to pick up this final point that he makes next week when I come back. So we'll finish up here. Thank you guys for being here. Thank you for just all the interaction in the live chat. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everything. I was just having too much fun talking to Paul. Sorry, guys. But thank you for being here. Thanks for the calls. Hopefully this at least just gave you something to think through, and I'm sure a lot more stuff will come in the comments afterwards, and I appreciate that. And as always, other videos are going to pop up on the side here in a little bit that help you think about different issues. A lot of different stuff I've discussed here on the show to help you think well about the Christian faith as well as cultural issues. And until then, have a wonderful rest of your week and a great weekend, and I will see you next time. And until then, continue to think deeply about God, Christianity, and Jesus, because they are worth thinking about. See you, everybody.